Top 10 Deadly Pandemics of the Past. A pandemic happens when a sickness transforms into a worldwide flare-up. The ongoing coronavirus, COVID-19, is currently viewed as a pandemic. The lethal infection is influencing individuals everywhere throughout the world. It is making nations close their fringes, ask individuals to remain inside, and request organizations to stop tasks. Nonetheless, this isn't the first occasion when a pandemic has influenced such huge numbers of lives on the double. Right now, look at the absolute deadliest pandemics of the past. Our top starts from leprosy, the Middle Ages. Infection, otherwise known as Hansen's sickness, is a moderate creating bacterial ailment that can prompt harm of the nerves, skin, eyes, and respiratory tract. Those tainted by the illness may encounter poor visual perception and muscle shortcoming. A few patients can no longer feel torment, which may bring about the halfway loss of furthest points. The malady has influenced people for a large number of years, yet it turned into a pandemic in Europe during the Middle Ages. As they were regarded to be unclean, contaminated people needed to wear certain dress or a chime to hide their appearance. It is accepted that around outsider houses existed in Europe during this time. Called the living dead, outsiders were connected to sin and pronounced lawfully dead by municipal pioneers who seized the things of the wiped out. There are still around instances of uncleanliness a year, however it would now be able to be restored with drug. Nineth our top is the third cholera pandemic. The deadliest of the 7 cholera flare-ups was the third significant flare-up that kept going from 1852 to 1860. Much the same as the initial two pandemics, the third started in India and spread all through Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. In 1854, the most noticeably awful year, cholera murdered individuals in Great Britain. Around of those casualties were from London. During the third cholera pandemic, around 1 million individuals lost their lives. Numerous passings originated from Russia, Chicago, Tokyo, Spain, Venezuela, and Brazil. Debased water was believed to be the reason for cholera. British Dr. John Snow followed cases in London and distinguished defiled water as the reason for the transmission of the infection. He followed the water to the Broad Street siphon and persuaded neighborhood authorities to expel the siphon handle. Eighth in our top is Russian flu. The Russian influenza, otherwise known as Asiatic influenza, was a destructive flu pandemic that executed roughly 1 million individuals around the world. The episode began spreading in 1889 and was the biggest 19th century pestilence of flu. It was additionally the main genuine pandemic that occurred in the time of bacteriology. The beginning cases were accounted for in Bukhara in Central Asia, Turkestan, Athabasca in northwestern Canada, and Greenland. Inside a half year, the sickness had contaminated St. Petersburg, Russia. Just 4 months after the fact, the flu had spread all through the northern side of the equator. Fast populous development in urban zones over the globe assisted with making a pandemic. Seventh place in our top is smallpox, 1520. For a considerable length of time, smallpox was a danger in Europe, Asia, and Arabia. 3 of each 10 tainted individuals passed on. The main European travelers carried the infection to the New World, where individuals were not resistant to the malady. The individuals of current Mexico and the United States saw passing rates a lot higher than those of the Old World. Some episodes of smallpox were viewed as plagues. Here, we'll talk about the one of every 1520 that crushed the Aztec Empire. Be that as it may, by and large, the spread of the illness over the globe made it a pandemic. In North and South America, smallpox took roughly 100 years to demolish around 90% of the indigenous individuals. In Mexico, the populace dropped to 1 million individuals from around 11 million preceding the European triumph. Sixth place in our top is Antonine Plague. Probably the deadliest pandemic in history is additionally one of the most established. The Antonine Plague happened in and eventually ended the lives of around individuals. The Romans carried the illness back home with them after a war with the Parthians. The malady began in Asia Minor and afterward spread to Greece and Italy. For the following 2 decades, the Roman Empire saw a flare-up dissimilar to anything they had ever experienced. At the pinnacle of the spread, they were seeing around fatalities for each day. It was assessed that percent of the whole Roman Empire was killed, with higher rates in denser areas. The domain's corolars Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus both passed on during this time span. Many have hypothesized that they were slaughtered by this sickness. Fifth place in our top is the Great Plague. As a major aspect of the Second Plague pandemic, the Great Plague of 1665 made pioneers close all open amusement and seal the wiped out in their homes to help forestall the spread of the infection. On the whole, London lost around 15% of its populace. Despite the fact that the city recorded roughly passings, the genuine number is accepted to be over. When the plague showed up in a family, a red cross was painted on the entryway with the words, "Master, show kindness toward us." Later, the dormant bodies were expelled and taken in a truck to a plague pit. Fourth place in our top is Asian flu. In the 20th century, the second significant flu pandemic was the Asian influenza of 1957, otherwise known as the Asian influenza pandemic. The episode was liable for more than 1 million deaths. At the start of the Asian influenza pandemic, the infection spread all through China and the encompassing districts. Months after the fact, this season's flu virus had arrived at the United States and was brought in the United Kingdom. Just 3 months into 1958, the United States had assessed that about passings were connected to the Asian influenza. An antibody was in the end built up that contained the pandemic. Third place in our top is Black Death. One of the most wrecking pandemics in history was the Great Bubonic Plague, otherwise known as the Dark Death, in the mid-1300s. A fatal episode of the bubonic plague began in China during the 1330s. As the nation was one of the busiest exchanging countries, the malady immediately spread elsewhere. By 1347, the Black Death had shown up in Europe after a few contaminated boats docked at Messina, a Sicilian port. Only 5 years after the fact, the plague had executed more than 20 million individuals in Europe. The Black Death is generally accepted to have been brought about by Yersinia pestis microscopic organisms. Second place in our top is the Third Plague pandemic. In 1855, during the Shanfeng Emperor's rule of the Qing administration, the Third Plague pandemic started in China. This destructive bubonic plague in the long run went through India and Hong Kong, executing in any event million individuals. India endured the most losses with in excess of 10 million deaths. This was the third major bubonic plague flare-up to hit European culture. The ailment was at first spread by bugs during a mining blast in Yunnan, China. Losses from the Third Plague pandemic dropped to less than 200 every year in 1960. Around then, the World Health Organization discovered that the plague was not, at this point, dynamic. First place in our top is Spanish flu.
The deadliest influenza pandemic in history began in 1918 and tainted around 33% of the total populace, or roughly 500 million individuals. Despite the fact that appraisals differ, it is accepted that the Spanish influenza slaughtered around 50 million individuals, including right around Americans.
The first rush of the flu happened in spring 1918, and it was commonly mellow. The subsequent wave was exceptionally infectious and hit the world with a vengeance. The Spanish influenza was at first found in Europe, the United States, and Asia before spreading over the globe. Survivors of the flu were biting the dust inside hours and long stretches of creating indications. The normal life expectancy in the US had diminished by 12 years after the Spanish influenza had been around for just a single year.